All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Had to postpone this yesterday. My building caught the news that I was going to do a stream, and the property management just decided they're going to test all the fire alarms. So I couldn't have that blaring while we were doing this. But here we are, and I want to welcome my first guest, Will Guillory of the Athletic, Pelicans beat writer, NBA writer in general for them. Thanks for doing this. I'm excited. You're my first guest. How are you
Oh
doing
man,
today?
it's an honor to be the first guest. I'm feeling good. Happy we were able to put the fire alarms behind us. Although I'm a rookie on the Discord here, so I'm figuring some things out. But we got it right, so we're ready to roll.
Yeah, and so this is just going to be a normal conversation for any of you who have seen what I've been doing on my videos and my stream. It's just been me, and I do all the salary cap stuff. We're not going to do any of that in this. This is just a normal conversation. Will specifically told me, "Hey, if you pull out a single cap sheet, like I'm leaving this. I don't want any of that." So
I'm
yeah,
completely
this
out.
is normal, huh?
I'm completely out. If we start talking
Yeah.
first apron, second apron repercussions, I'm out.
Yeah, we really won't be getting too much into that. More like bigger picture about the Pelicans. So I'm mostly going to be, I think, like over the next month or so, I'll probably be talking about some of the worst teams in the league, just because a lot of these teams, their season's like mostly done for the most part, other than just playing out the games and just seeing what you really got. And I think for the Pelicans, that's a very big thing given all their injuries. They've never really had a chance to put this team that they put together all together on the court. So I want to start on that first, because I've been looking at their injuries, and on SpotRack they have a nice stat about most missed games due to injuries, and this year Pelicans are at the top. They're already like over 200 missed games due to injuries. And I know people want to talk about how they're cursed because this is not a one-off thing. Injuries have been pretty frequent, but usually it's kind of like maybe one or two guys get a significant injury, miss a lot of time for the Pelicans. But I was just thinking about this. Kind of seems like almost like a decade now, like around the time they became the Pelicans almost. I just remember like back when when they brought in Drew Holiday, Tyreek Evans. They had a lot of injuries even back then, and I saw like between like the mid 2015s even they would be top 10 often. SpotRack was able to go that far back as far as being top 10 in missed games per year. So I know, look, this is impossible to really answer. I'm sure you've been asked this so many times, but is there anything you could add to like what's going on? Because it just seems like Pelicans and injuries have always been going hand in hand.
I mean, I think they gotta invest in like a voodoo doctor, or they gotta find out, who's buried under the Smoothie King Center. There's something going on for sure. I think, I would say pre this current regime, I think there was a lot of work that needed to be done with the medical staff and the way they did some of those things behind the scenes that kind of lent to a guy like Drew Holiday having issues with his shin that extended way longer than he should have, right? Where he ended up having multiple surgeries on his leg to fix something that probably should have been fixed in 1 year. Or Tyreek Evans, his knee kind of blowing up on him and them never being able to get that back right. I think there were some things where they with a more mindful approach to the way they did things medically, that iteration of the team probably wouldn't have gone as poorly as it did. I think, obviously, whenever we talk this current iteration of the Pelicans, we got to talk about Zion Williamson and the constant injuries that he's dealt with throughout his career. Some of that you could say is his fault. Some of that you could say medical staff could have done things better, whatever. Ultimately, he's missed a ton of time, and that's affected this team over the past 6 years. But I would say this year specifically, a lot of it, I think, man, it sounds crazy. I think a lot of it just really bad luck when you talk about, day two of training camp. Trey Murphy strains his hamstring. He's out for a month plus. The very first game of the season, DeJounte Murray breaks a hand. There's not much a medical staff can do about him just getting his hand caught in the jersey and breaking his hand. He's out for a month. Herb Jones out there in a game against Golden State. Brandon Pajemski falls on his shoulder injures his shoulder. Now Herb Jones is out for a month. Ultimately, Herb comes back, re-injures that same shoulder. Now he's out for the season, undergoing surgery. So I think a lot of this stuff, yeah, maybe you could say, CJ McCollum injured his groin early in the year. Maybe they do things differently. Some injuries like that are avoidable, but a lot of this stuff, it's just, poor timing, bad luck, wrong place, wrong time, whatever it is. I just think it's just one of those seasons where everything went wrong and there really wasn't much they could do about it. And it's really unfortunate because I think when you talk to a lot of the people within the organization, they came into this year feeling like this was the most talented roster they ever put together around Zion Williamson. When you talk about three former All-Stars in the starting lineup to go with Herb Jones, to go with Trey Murphy, C.J. McCollum. And that was before we even knew about Yves Missi and what he's been able to do this season. And it just, unfortunately, that group just was never able to see the court. I've tweeted the stat before. Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, DeJounte Murray never played a minute together as teammates before Brandon Ingram ultimately got traded to the Toronto Raptors, which is insane. Just to think that they had so much expectations coming into the season, and ultimately they never got to see what it looked like.
I think it is probably, you explained the best. It's a combination of a lot of bad luck, particularly this year. And then, yeah, there might be some things medical staff wise, we don't know. And it's interesting how the Pelicans, they probably had the biggest attention to their medical staff changes. Like I remember when they hired the Suns staffer in 2019, that was news. You don't hear really that much, those kind of moves for teams. But it's just unfortunate because, yeah, they've never really had a chance to really take off. There's very few chances over these past 6 years. So let's touch on what you kind of started getting into, but how good this team could be, because I was gonna get there a little later, but since we're already there, might as well get into it because I've always been very high on the Pelicans. The moment they made the Anthony Davis trade, I love the return for them. I think they got so much at the time, and they were fortunate to be able to select Zion Williamson, and they just were really able to quickly get transition to this next era. It felt to me like they could have become contenders by 2022, 2023. And then we saw in 2022, once Zion came back from his foot injury, he was unbelievable. I can't recall anyone playing quite like him. Just 70% from the field, like it's nothing on a nightly basis. And then, the injuries start then he gets injured again. And, once he started playing like that, I felt like, okay, you know what, I'm really starting to see the vision of what I felt in 2019. And then slowly since then, it's just kind of chipped away. And now he's starting to kind of show some flashes of that form, but the issue just whenever he just, once he gets off the court, it takes him a while to get back to that form. And now I'm just starting to feel like because all these injuries just really prevent them from taking off, it feels like I'm just feeling a little more down on what their high-end outcome is. So let me ask you, if everything goes right for this core and knowing that they still have the moves to add on to this, add more complementary pieces, what do you feel like is the highest end outcome now going forward?
I think that's, part of the unfortunate thing about where they are currently, because I think, coming into the season, there was understanding that they were probably going to move on from Brandon Ingram, right? Once you give Trey Murphy that big extension and you don't give B.I. his extension, I think we all saw the writing on the wall where that thing was headed. Now, ultimately, was it going to end in him walking in free agency or trade? I think that was up in the air for a certain extent. But, we all knew that at a certain point it was going to become Brandon Ingram, not Brandon, it was going to be Zion Williamson, Trey Murphy, and DeJounte Murray as the leaders of this team, kind of transitioning from the B.I. Zion era. And unfortunately, now we can't really say what the best case scenario for this team is going to look like, because even beyond this season from hell where everybody is injured, it's going to bleed into next year, because now DeJounte Murray has a torn Achilles. And we know with that particular injury, he's probably going to be out at least the first few months of next season, if not, maybe even all the way up until All-Star. Who knows? I mean, he injured it this year in January. And a lot of times guys are out for a full calendar year before they come back. And then and we know also with this injury, even when you do come back and you're on the court, it takes some time before you really look and feel like yourself, right? And for some guys, they never get back to that point. They never look like the guy they were before their injury. So I think that's really the scary thing for this team moving forward is they invested a lot in DeJounte Murray, not just as a player who can complement Zion Williamson, but that leader in the locker room, that voice, that guy who can speak up during some of the tough times. I think you even saw during stretches early in this season where DeJounte's voice really got through to Zion. I think more than maybe any other teammate he's ever had. I think those guys developed a real connection early on. You saw it on the court. You saw the way they spoke about each other in the media. And now without DeJounte there, I think it leaves a massive hole for this team in the lineup and in the locker room. And I think, the funny thing, I think, you've kind of alluded to it, that I think a lot of people with this Pelicans team, they're at the point where it's like, man, there's so many injuries, so many disappointing seasons. Just blow it up. Just forget it. It's time to give up on the Zion Williamson era. You tried. It didn't work. See what you can do. Just tank for Cooper Flag and see if you can build from there. And what I would say to a lot of those people is, if you watch Zion Williamson this year, and in particular the past couple months, I think this is the best Zion Williamson has ever looked as a pro. When I talk about his physical shape, the way he's moving around on the court, I was in Sacramento a week or so ago, and I saw him drop 40 in 28 minutes against Sacramento. I mean, just easily knifing through the paint, getting on the boards, playing defensively, just the way his burst, his physicality. I think it's at a completely different level right now, and I think he's doing a lot to really focus on his work off the court, to make sure his body is right, to make sure his conditioning is right, and I think he looks incredible right now. And I think a lot of people who are getting into talks about, well, maybe you should move on from Zion Williamson, I think you got to watch what he looks like right now, man, because if you do, it's really hard for me to trade that guy. But to your original question, what does the ceiling look like for this team? I think it's really hard to tell because there are so many questions about everybody around Zion, right? I think the big issue with this team for years has been they got so many great pieces and you can't figure out the Zion part. And I think now you feel really good about where Zion is, but now is Trey Murphy ready to be a true number two on a championship caliber team? I'm not sure. I think he's made a significant jump this year, but can he be that guy on a real contender in the West? I'm not sure. What does DeJounte Murray look like when he comes back next year? I'm not sure. While he's out, what do you do to replace those minutes at point guard? I think that's going to be a big question. So I think when you ask what's the ceiling for this team, my answer is I really don't know, because they have a lot of questions that still are unanswered at this point because of the position they put themselves in right now.
So you touch on two big factors into what I think really dictate what their ceiling will be going forward. I'm not so worried about Trey Murphy. I think he's been really good. And as far as, and we'll get into like the player performances, like when you look past the injuries. So number one is Zion, where as long as he just needs to stay on the court, because we know how great he is and he can really carry them far. But just the biggest thing is that once he gets off, then it's hard to get back. Then you got DeJounte Murray, who you brought up. He's going to miss a lot of time next year. But this is now another big concern about their ceiling because, they traded now in retrospect a good amount to get him. Just seeing how Dyson Daniels has played now, the trade's looking a lot better for Atlanta. I liked it a lot more for the Pelicans at the time. And I still do, just when you look at the type of player DeJounte Murray that they were acquiring him in, and it just made a lot of sense to bring him in. Now, though, this Achilles injury, not only is he going to miss time, but I'm starting to get I'm concerned now. Like, what kind of player can he be returning from that? And I know that injury recovery from Achilles has gotten a lot better. We've seen a lot better players come back from that and be able to extend their careers. But I'm kind of concerned now. Like, what kind of player are they getting back now once he returns from this? Because this is just a devastating blow.
There's no doubt. I mean, the history is dim when you look at the guys who have injured their Achilles, especially at the point guard position, and what they look like when they come back. And when you think about DeJounte Murray's play style, he's not exactly the most explosive guy at the position anyway. So if you take away some of that explosiveness, what does he look like? And I think, a big strength in his game is obviously his size and his length at the point guard position, his ability to create steals, getting into the lane, creating, passing lanes for other guys. How good is he going to be at those things, if he can't move the same way, if he's not, moving around with the same confidence. And I think the one thing I will say about DeJounte Murray is I wasn't around him for a very long time, but the time that I was, you could really tell, how seriously he takes his work off the court and taking care of his body and, the game in general. He spoke a lot about, the pride he takes in being on the court every single night and taking advantage of the opportunity to be an NBA player, how he doesn't take it for granted, the position he's in. So I know he's going to attack this rehab head on, and I know he's going to want to come back earlier than a lot of people expect. But man, with this particular injury, it's just so damaging, and it's just so difficult to come back from. And of course, people are going to have their questions about this Pelicans medical staff and how much they're putting him in the correct positions to come back. But I do think, again, I think a lot of it is going to come down to Zion Williamson and how he's able to lift everybody up around him. I think throughout his tenure, in New Orleans, a lot of people have looked at all the pieces they've put around him that have been able to lift him up, and the way that they've had so much success in the draft and some of the pieces they've acquired in trades. And it's like, man, they have all of this stuff. They just need Zion. And now I think they need Zion to lift everybody up around him while DeJounte's gone. And I think that's going to be a big question if he's capable of doing that, not just with his play, but just with his presence. And I think this is going to be one of the bigger tests of his career. Can he lift this team up while DeJounte is gone and put them in a position where DeJounte can help push them over that hump to get, into maybe next year's playoffs. But it's going to be a big test. And I think, for DeJounte, it's going to be, one of the tougher mental tests he's had to deal with throughout his life, coming back from this Achilles injury. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how he approaches it and how long he ends up sitting out and what the Pelicans do to kind of replace some of the things that they were hoping he could provide.
I think you bring up a great point about Zion. He's now like the veteran leader of this team, even though I think he's only like 25. Because Ingram's gone now. He had more seniority. And Murray's out. He's older veteran. Yeah, this is really like Zion's team now more than ever. So this will be a very big test for him. Be very interested to see how well he can take this. But then also, I know I'll give DeJounte Murray credit. You talk about how he's going to tackle this recovery head on. I'll give him credit. He did suffer an ACL injury early on in his career, and he came back better than ever. So if anyone can rebound from this and stay at a similar level to him, just hopefully, these multiple injuries aren't taking a toll on him, and because it could add up. So. Hopefully he can come back and at least remain at the level he was. Now I want to just talk about the general performance of some of the players, looking past the injuries, because obviously I think you gotta just chalk up like 75% at least of what's going on to the injuries. But you're going to also, if you're the Pelicans, you got to take a deep, close up look as much as possible to see what you got and who you want to continue with going forward. And early on, I remember when I really took a deep dive at the Pelicans early on, like almost everybody was having a down year. Like DeJounte Murray, once he came back, he was pretty bad. CJ and Zion, while they struggled early on, they starting to pick things up recently. Herb Jones, his shot just kind of fell apart this year. Jordan Hawkins, not really much of a step forward. I'm not sure if he has improved. I haven't been paying too much attention to him. It seems like the biggest improvement were Trey Murphy, mainly that his usage went up and his percentages stayed solid. That's a great sign. And then you had Brandon Ingram, who's I noticed he's having his best 3-point shooting season, where he upped his volume to the most, and he was shooting like 38%, but he's gone now, and he didn't even play that much this year. So I wanted to ask you though, like knowing all this, and like just kind of how overwhelmingly, at least early on in the season, a lot of players were struggling. How do you think their performance will factor into evaluations, again, despite these overwhelming injuries?
I think the first one you got to start off with is Trey Murphy, right? The jump he's made, since January 1st, he's averaging around 25 a game, up there around the 50, 40, 90 clip. I think it's just been incredible to see him improve in such a dramatic way. And I think the big thing is not just the numbers. I think he's improving in several areas where you would want to see him improve as a new number two guy, right? You want to say, hey, Trey Murphy, you've been an elite three-point shooter. Can you make more plays off the dribble? He's done that very well this season. Trey Murphy, can you get to the free throw line more often? He's done that at a high level this season. Trey Murphy, can you increase your usage and remain efficient in everything you're doing? He's done that. Like I said, he's still around 50, 40, 90 with the increased usage, averaging around 25 a game, for the past few months. So I think he's ticking a lot of the boxes you want to see from a guy that's stepping into that role. Now it's just about maintaining consistency, obviously. It's about, can you lift up what you do defensively? I think is going to be a big question. That's been one of the weaknesses in his game defensively, specifically in one-on-one situations. Can he hold up? And I think he's done a fairly good job with that. And I think, ultimately, I think, I've been one of the big Brandon Ingram, supporters, and a guy who's spoken highly about Brandon Ingram throughout his time in New Orleans. But ultimately, I think it's clear to see that Trey Murphy in a vacuum is a much better fit next to Zion Williamson as a complementary piece because of his ability to stretch the floor, his ability to get out of Zion's way and allow Zion to dominate the paint and force defenses to make really tough decisions about, are you going to prevent Trey from shooting threes, or are you going to prevent Zion from shooting layups? But the big thing for Trey is just that he's really stepping into that role. And I think you really see the confidence in his game. He's already talking about wanting to be an all-star next year. He's consistently coming up with these big games, 20, 25, 30-point games. And now, the main goal for this team moving forward has to be getting as many minutes possible with Zion Williamson and Trey Murphy on the court together, figuring out what that looks like, figuring out how they can play together, how they can close games out together, so you can build upon that going into next season, because that's what next season is going to be all about. Trey Murphy, Zion Williamson, and Rookie X, whoever they end up getting in the top five. I'm sure we're going to talk about that at some point, what those three guys look like, how they play together. And I think, with the jump Trey Murphy has made, that has been by far the biggest win of this season, him proving that he can play at that level consistently, so you don't feel as bad losing out on Brandon Ingram. But now, like I said, the big thing for him now is just maintaining that consistency and showing that he can maintain that level of usage while also being as efficient as he's been throughout his career.
I think for the most part, yeah, they've gotten enough from their top guys that they got to feel, I think they should feel pretty good going forward. And you mentioned early on about why don't the Pelicans just blow it up or whatever it is. The Pelicans have been pretty good when they're fully healthy. They topped out as an 8 seed the past few years, but they're definitely not going to just, actually enter a rebuild, like, especially since at least this year they're going to get a top pick in the upcoming draft, which will give them a lot of options there. But as far as like the season as a whole, I'm just kind of looking at things where, for the most part, the injuries definitely took a toll. Where it takes a toll when you have a different rotation, a different lineup almost every night, at least in the early part of the season. But at the same time, what I'm a little concerned is how the management might look at the season, where they had like 9, 11, and 10 game losing streaks, like individually, and they've only had one-off loss. Like, they've only had one loss this season that didn't accompany a losing streak. From when I looked at their schedule, I'm just taking a look at all this, and I'm just knowing how the league works, whether it's justified or fair or not. I'm wondering how they might feel about Willie Green going forward, just because maybe they'll take a look at everything and say, look, we understand that this team was injured, but just seeing how some of our guys played, especially early on, are we actually as bad as the Hornets? Should we be as bad as the what other team are they kind of tied with? they're one of those other bottom dwellers.
Utah's right around there.
Yeah, so they're tied for second. They're kind of like they have like a 3-way tie for second worst record. Maybe they don't feel like this team should have been this bad this year despite the injuries, because we all know this team is much more talented than all this. They'd be probably pushing for a play-in spot if they were fully healthy. So just knowing how the league works, that's just something I kind of will have in the back of my mind. All that, but now you were talking about, like, we need more of a sample size.
To your point, with the Willie Green, I do think a big question for this team. That's funny because when you look at last year's team, the 49-win team, I think a lot of people look at and say, hey, they got Zion Williamson healthy for most of the season. They got Brandon Ingram healthy most of the season. That was the key to their success. They had 3 20-point scorers. But I think when you really watch that team, the reason why they were so successful night to night was because they were so good defensively and so disruptive defensively. And I think such a huge part of their success was the fact that they had Herb Jones, Dyson Daniels, Najee Marshall, Jose Alvarado, Larry Nance. These guys with these defensive mindsets who they brought in every single night, where they were able to be disruptive on the ball, they were able to create turnovers, and it made things much easier for everybody else to get their shots, to get their looks. And when you really watch them in half court, a lot of times it was a struggle when they were forced to play half court ball, and that's why they really wanted to go get DeJounte Murray, because it felt a little clunky at times, and specifically when the big three played together, CJ, Zion, and Brandon Ingram. And if you look at the numbers from last year, that team was great, but when those 3 guys were on the court together, they were pretty average. And I think a big part of the question moving forward is, okay, if you're moving into a new era, and now with Trey Murphy as your number 2 best guy, potentially a rookie like, say, Dylan Harper or Ace Bailey as your next guy behind those guys, do you take more of an offensive mindset? Willie Green, since he became the New Orleans, his focus has been defense, defense, defense. For the past 2 seasons, they were number 6 in defense, back-to-back seasons. We think about Herb Jones being first-team all-defense. That was a big part of who they were. I wonder if they look forward and say, maybe our mindset should be more about making this an explosive offense, making this a team that's built around Zion and Trey Murphy, and them leading a team that scores 120, 130 every single night, rather than this team that wants to have these, really tough, gritty defensive games like they did a lot of the times last year. And I think, if that's the case, I think that does, lend to, hey, maybe Willie Green is not the guy. Maybe you look at, somebody else. Maybe you look at a James Marenko, who's already on the bench, more of an offensive-minded coach. We know what he did with Charlotte for several years, building up their offense. I think there are going to be a lot of questions about not just the build of this team, but what's their approach going forward, now that that the roster is going to look different with so many new faces. And I think a lot of that lends to, okay, how does Willie Green fit in this? And I think that's going to be a big question of, not just, removing Brandon Ingram and inserting Trey Murphy, but how does that change your entire approach moving forward?
Okay. No, I was just kind of thinking, I'm just a little concerned about just maybe they take this, what the Pelicans did, and really take it in a way that they feel like Willie Green might not be the guy. And I don't even feel that strongly about it. I was just kind of putting it out there, but no, that's interesting, where maybe there's like a stylistic approach that they might even end up actually having a serious conversation about that. So no, let's see. It'd be kind of similar like what the Cavs just did, going from JB to Kenny Atkinson, a little more offensive focused. Let's quickly get into the trade deadline, and then we can get into the offseason, more like future stuff. So Brandon Ingram was for the most part available for like almost a year. And when they, what was I going to ask? So they finally trade him. They trade him to Toronto Raptors. Mainly get Bruce Brown, expiring salary, Kelly Olynyk, salary filler, but he can play a part for this team this year and next year. And 1 first-round pick, which it's a Pacers pick. Pacers have been pretty good this year, last year, bearing like a big injury or just something unexpected. That first-round pick might not be anything super high. How do you feel about the return? And do you also feel like maybe they waited a little too long to trade him?
I think, based on the conversations I've had with people in the organization, I think there was a legit fear throughout the process that they really weren't going to get anything in any of these Brandon Ingram talks. I think that was a big reason why they didn't trade him last summer, because they really felt like none of the offers were really worthy, and they felt like there was a real concern that like the market on BI was just very cold, because it wasn't just obviously people see the talent in BI, but it's about committing to him with that long-term contract that he ultimately got from Toronto, right? And I think obviously the Pels weren't going to give that to him after signing Trey Murphy, but once you looked around the league, there just weren't a whole lot of candidates out there because of the new restrictions of the CBA and how tough it is to kind of put into a box how much a Brandon Ingram is worth in today's NBA. Because I think previous CBA, you probably would have said, hey, he's former All-Star, mid-30s-ish, just give him the max and you figure it out from there. And I think in today's NBA, you just can't do that because it's just so tough to get off of those contracts and to kind of build the rest of your roster once you start getting in the first apron, second apron world. Now, I'm the one bringing up the apron. Let me chill out. But I
I'm
think,
all for it.
I just think, ultimately, like you said, the pick that they got from Indy wasn't amazing, but still, it's lightly protected, only top four protected, which you feel pretty good about. And I think it is a team that it's in the East, so they're more likely to kind of be lower on the totem pole than some of these, really good Western Conference teams. So I think they walk away from it saying, hey, we got a really good expiring contract in Bruce Brown that'll give us some cap flexibility. Kelly Olynyk is a guy who can give them some pretty good minutes at backup center, a guy who can fit next to Zion Williamson, and ultimately a very tradable contract if they wanted to move him in the offseason. And then you get that first-round pick, which gives you, more flexibility to rebuild this thing if you want to, bring in two more rookies in the summer of 2026, or additional trade assets where you can start looking around and saying, like I talked about before, hey, do you want to get a stopgap point guard to play while DeJounte Murray is out? You got one more first-round pick now to give you that ability. Or you want to stack up a few of these first-round picks and go get another guy. You can do that now with more draft assets now that you no longer have any more Lakers picks. And I think they only have one Bucks pick left, I want to say, from the Drew Holiday trade. So now their draft assets are starting to diminish a little bit. So adding one more to the mix helps. But I do think ultimately you didn't get a whole lot for Brandon Ingram. I think a lot of people in the organization thought highly of him, but I think considering the circumstances, I think they walk away from it feeling like they did pretty good, considering there weren't a whole lot of teams vying for him. Because ultimately, at the end, I can tell you it was Atlanta and Toronto were the two teams, and I don't think they really thought they were going to get a whole lot from Atlanta. And I think Atlanta was kind of sitting around saying, we're going to hold and see if you really can get anything, because I think Atlanta thought they can kind of get away with getting him for nothing. And then them ultimately getting that first-round pick from Toronto, I think, is what pushed this thing over and ultimately landed him in Toronto.
I think this is exactly the kind of return I expected for Brandon Ingram, just given his contract situation. And also just I like Ingram a lot. Not exactly the easiest guy to plug into most teams. And also when you just look around, see what a lot of other All-Stars have been going for this season, see what Luka just went for. Like the price to acquire All-Stars have gone down a little bit. So this was kind of like what I expected, but especially given that he was expiring and probably not such a big market for him. One first-round pick's about what I kind of thought they'd get, which is, I think it's fine. And
don't you think in this new world, like the days where we're seeing like Drew Holiday go for 3 first-round picks, don't you think that's just like a thing of the past now, just because of this new CBA?
Well, so actually, on Third Apron, my newsletter, I've talked a lot about different reasons why that might be. The CBA, I think at one hand, that kind of plays into it, because now it's so much harder for teams to build your roster without draft picks going forward. They're way more valuable now. You want to conserve them more. But the other thing is you had so many teams starting in like 2019 when the Lakers traded a bunch of picks to get Anthony Davis, when the Clippers traded a bunch of picks to get Paul George, and that kept going up until 2 years ago. The Wolves traded their entire draft for Rudy Gobert. The Suns traded their entire draft for Kevin Durant. There's too many of these teams like mortgaging all their first round picks that now there's like not any first round picks left to trade for a lot of these teams. All of them are owned by Oklahoma City, Brooklyn, and Utah now.
Yeah.
So I think that might be a bigger reason why the price has gone down, because like if the Lakers had more picks to trade, okay, maybe they probably would have had to give up more to get Luka Doncic. And then on the other hand, you have the Spurs. They have a lot of picks, and they didn't even give up any of the good ones to get De'Aaron Fox. But that's like a whole nother dynamic there. So I as far as that goes, I just think there's like the teams that would want to trade for a guy like Ingram either may have already had such a high payroll that they can't really fit him, or they didn't have anything else to trade at this point, which I think what benefited a team like the Raptors, who they don't even have like a big pick surplus. They just have all their own first round picks, plus that one Pacers pick. That's all they had to give up. And they had a willingness to bring him in, I think, ultimately. But yeah, to answer that the other question I asked was if I think they waited too long. I don't know. It just like there were rumors that the Kings were interested in the previous offseason. We'll never really know what else they could have gotten, but I don't think it would have been that much more than what they got now. But I want to ask you just a little bit about Ingram, because I've been pretty negative on this trade for the Raptors just because the fit and how weird it's going to look, I think, initially. But you watch a lot more Brandon Ingram than I do. I mean, how do you feel about it going to Toronto? Do you think it could work? Like it could be a lot better than a lot of people anticipate?
I do think we have to factor in his mentality going into this, because I think he's heard a lot of the talk over the past year about people saying his value's down. Nobody wants Brandon Ingram. Are you going to get anything for Brandon Ingram? Does anybody want to sign Brandon Ingram? I think he's going to go into that situation with a real desire to prove a lot of people wrong. And BI with a chip on his shoulder, I think, could be a really good thing for Toronto, especially because, I really like Scotty Barnes, but they really haven't had a guy that's kind of separated himself and said, hey, I'm the clear number one guy. I'm going to carry this team, especially on the offensive end. And I think BI can potentially, become that guy if he kind of, he continues to improve and do a lot of the little things that he didn't do in New Orleans. I think he can be that guy in Toronto. But ultimately, if you're going to build a team with R.J. Barrett, Brandon Ingram, and Scotty Barnes in your starting lineup, I think the spacing is going to be a real issue. And then you got Pirtle at the 5. I think that the spacing, you mentioned that BI, made a point of shooting more threes this year. And I think, he was successful in doing that for a short stint. He didn't really get to play a whole lot with Zion, but I think that was, his intent coming into the season was to be a better floor spacer next to Z. And perhaps he takes that into Toronto and say, I want to be a better floor spacer for Scotty and RJ. But I think, personally, I still think the best version of that team in Toronto is going to be when Scotty and BI are the guys, controlling the offense. And I think that lends, real questions to what are they going to do with R.J. Barrett? How does he fit as an off-the-ball player? How much can you play Pirtle and Barnes together if Barnes is the guy with the ball in his hands? I think that's going to be some real questions. And then, they're kind of in the same position that the Pelicans were kind of fearful of being in, where they've got all of these guys, and now they're heavily invested in all of these guys. They just gave Quickly a huge contract. They just gave Scotty Barnes a huge contract. They just gave BI a big contract. So now this is your team, and like we'll see how good they are. But I don't think anybody's going to be picking the Raptors to win the East next year with these guys. And now you're heavily invested in them. You don't have a whole lot of flexibility to move off of this group. So I think that's some of the real concerns now, is that you got some really good young players, but how good are you really? And the amount of money you're spending for these guys, is it ultimately going to be worth it?
I think you hit the nail on the head on just everything around the main core. I like what Ingram brings to the Raptors. They could really use a scorer like that. They haven't had someone like that in a while, or maybe since DeRozan. Pretty similar type, actually, player type. And I just think I like the price in a vacuum. 1 first round pick to bring him in. That's pretty good value to get in a guy like that talented. But yeah, I think they just have some work to do around the core. Mainly, you mentioned RJ Barrett. I wrote about him. I could see him being someone that maybe they move not only to help balance the spacing and shooting, have to let some of their other guards and wings off the bench play more and bring a better level of shooting and spacing. But also their tax bill, that's a very expensive team for someone that as of now is currently constructed. Not sure they're better than a first round exit at this point. So I'm a little optimistic as long as they can just, I think they just have some other work to do, and there's time for that. So we'll see. Then as far as this season though, and then we'll get into the off season. Do you think there's a point where they might end up just shutting things down to really try to maximize their draft pick? Because for the most part, they haven't had to. They're already, right. A lot of the work has been done for them.
My answer. It's like they've been playing all their guys and they got 13 wins. So, okay. Shut it down. I do think, once you get to April, once there's 2-3 weeks left of the season, maybe you say, hey, give Zion, maybe Zion has a tweaked ankle and you let him rest. Or maybe, Trey Murphy all of a sudden has a little bit of a back that he feels now and you set him out. We've seen this throughout the league, and ultimately, especially once we start getting closer to the finish line, a lot of these teams are going to start seeing that Cooper flag, waving in the air and saying, man, we could possibly get this guy. I think a lot of teams are going to really want that, especially if he goes on a crazy run during March Madness. I think a lot of teams are going to be like, man, we really, really want to go all in and try to get this guy. I think you can see that, but I think ultimately, like I said before, I think the main goal for this team has to be getting as many minutes as possible with Zion and Trey Murphy on the court together, getting those guys that time, getting Zion enough time to show that he can just play consistently without getting injured, right? I think as of now, they got to get him up where he's playing more than 30 minutes. He's not even playing 30 minutes per game yet this season. So you want to get him to that point where he can show that he can do that, where he can play 30, 32, 34 minutes per night without anything preventing him from staying on the court. Can he play back-to-backs? That might be a little bit of a stretch about the latter half of the season. But I think you want to keep him on the court as much as possible. Maybe they give Trey some time off, toward the end of the season. I know C.J. McCollum is a guy, you basically got to rip him off of the court to prevent him from playing. But like I said, I think they got the best of both worlds right now because they're playing all their guys and they're still losing. So I don't think you really need to do anything extra to stop them from continue to be at the top of the tank. I think the one thing you could probably say is, hey, CJ, can you stop scoring 40 points in some of these games? They got 13 wins this season, and 4 of them have come in games where CJ McCollum scored 38 or more points. So maybe you say, hey, CJ, keep it to 32 tonight, and then we can stay in the Cooper flag sweepstakes. But ultimately, I think this team is in prime position, and then ultimately, I think maybe even more than some of these other teams, they can feel pretty good about saying, hey, we'll take Dylan Harper and we'll be fine. We don't have to get Cooper flag, right? I think obviously everybody wants Cooper flag, but this is a team that wouldn't mind landing at number 3, number 4 in the lottery and getting one of those guys because whoever they draft probably isn't an instant starter anyway for all the reasons we mentioned before, other than, Cooper flag. But they don't really need somebody to step in day one and be a new starter. They just need to continue to add to the young pieces around Z, Trey Murphy, and CJ, and then go from there.
I agree with all that. I think the best case scenario is they finally are able to get a month plus healthy stretch, and maybe they play. I haven't looked at what their schedule is, but maybe there's a stretch of good teams coming up, and they're able to get a nice little winning streak to show that there is something to build towards for next year. And then maybe towards the end, okay, you just shut things down and you could position yourself for maybe a top 2-3 pick. Because if they are healthy for the rest of the season and they play to a level as what should be expected based on their talent, I would guess that they finish with like the 5th or 6th worst record. So that'll just be interesting to see if there's going to be any, interest in maximizing those odds. So now some off-season stuff. I've already had you on for a while, so let's try to, we could go through these a little quicker. In regard to that pick, now since they have the potential to get a top selection in what's considered a really stacked draft, especially at the top, I'm sure we're still going to hear a lot of speculation about Zion's future. It's been happening. The more these injuries happen, the more reports come out that there's like any sort of like, lack of contact with the front. There's always stuff like that going on, like reports like that. I'm sure like at this point now, I don't think anyone would, who's been following the league, pays attention to this stuff, would consider Zion untouchable. Now, I don't think that they would just move him just because. I don't know if they're he's still just unbelievable when he plays. But I also know that the Pelicans aren't like another organization that might trade a player for quote unquote fit conditioning stuff. And like, this is like a completely different case with Zion. Do you think there is something like a type of offer that the Pelicans would consider to just completely just end the Zion era? Is there something like if they were approached now, do you think they would like heavily consider? And would their upcoming pick, especially if it gets like the top, potentially give them some sort of like push to even consider doing something like that?
I would say first off, we just learned from Luka Doncic that probably literally no one in the league is untradeable unless you're like Bradley Beal and you got a no trade clause. But like, ultimately, I think we've seen that, these guys get moved even when we think it's impossible for them to be moved. And I think if you were to ask me now, do I think they're going to trade Zion Williamson in the offseason? No, I don't. I think, like I've said, I think he's playing some of the best basketball of his career right now. And ultimately, you're still in a market like New Orleans, and Zion sells a lot of jerseys. When he plays, they put people in the seats. And when he doesn't, they don't sell jerseys and they don't put people in the seats. So I think you still want a big star in this market. You want to be able to sell this team with a big star like Zion Williamson, especially if he's playing the way he has the past few weeks. And I think that's their ultimate goal, is to keep him playing at this level and to sell to the fan base, hey, he's healthy now. He's the real face of the franchise with B.I. gone, and he's building towards something next year with this new draft pick. Now, if they get the number 1 pick and they get Cooper Flag, I think this conversation becomes very interesting because Cooper Flag and Z kind of play the same position, right? Their games are very similar in a lot of ways. And I think it wouldn't end, for all of the reasons I said, non-basketball, Cooper Flag is going to be a guy who sells a lot of jerseys. Cooper Flag is going to be a guy who puts a lot of butts in seats. So I think you lose less of that fear when you kind of say, okay, we've got Cooper Flag now. We don't need Zion to sell this team, right? Cooper Flag is going to be our big star. Cooper Flag is going to be the thing that we sell to the fan base. So if they do get the number 1 pick, it wouldn't shock me if we start hearing some Zion Williamson stuff, because it feels like a very easy transition, right? They can basically do the exact same thing they're doing now and just plug Cooper Flag into that 4 spot instead of Zion Williamson. Now, ultimately, if you ask me, I would say, why not just have Cooper Flag and Zion Williamson? Those 2 guys are very talented. You can kind of figure it out. You don't have to win an NBA championship next year. At least see what it looks like with those 2 guys and then figure it out. But I do think, I think ultimately if lottery night, the Pelicans win it, I think the talk is going to be, wow, the Pelicans got the number 1 pick again. And then it's going to be, should the Pelicans move Zion Williamson? That's where the talk is immediately going to go. There's no question about it. But I do think that, like I said, I think more talented players is a good thing, and you still got Zion Williamson under contract for multiple years on a deal that's still very flexible if he gets injured. Right, there's still some non-guaranteed years left on that deal, and ultimately, I think there's going to be some talk from Zion Williamson his side potentially want an extension on that deal. I believe he's extension eligible this summer, which is I think is
Yeah.
another a talking point that may arise as we get into the offseason. But I do think ultimately, like I said, I think with the way Z is playing right now, you want to keep him around. You want to continue to build around him, and you want him to kind of show that he can be that guy. And I think what I think a lot of the conversation around Dallas right now is, hey, Luka wasn't the perfect guy. Luka wasn't everything you wanted, but it's so hard to find one of those guys. And just to give him up in his mid-20s, I think it kind of ignores the fact that it's so difficult to find one of those guys. And I think Zion, to a lesser extent, kind of that same thing applies, where it's like, yes, there's a lot of stuff that Zion does that annoys the crap out of people in the Pelicans organization. I can tell you firsthand. I've heard the stories throughout the career, the tardiness, the inability to communicate at times, the lack of presence, the constant feeling that you got to bring people in to fill in the leadership void that you would hope he could fill. But ultimately, when that dude plays basketball, he's one of the most incredible players I've ever seen in this league, and that's what you want. You want guys who produce at a high level on the court, and that's what he does. And you might not like a lot of the other stuff, but it's hard to find someone who can do it at Zion's level when you get rid of him. You could say, we got all of these draft picks, we got these young guys who you could develop, and the vibes will be better. None of that matters unless you're winning, right? The vibes are great until you start losing, and then the vibes aren't great anymore. So I'm a big guy on, I want the talented basketball players in the building, and then you figure out all the other stuff later. So I'm a big proponent of, you keep Z, you figure out all the other stuff. But attached to that is, if you get Cooper Flag, I think it gets interesting.
Yeah, it's just tough because, it's like the third time we're bringing it up, how when Zion plays, he's just so good, but then as soon as he's out, there's like an instant regret, like, oh, like I this again. It's tough after so many years of dealing with this cycle, but ultimately, yeah, I don't think it's really hard to imagine them getting offered something that they would have to just knowing all these factors surrounding him and his health. It's hard to imagine them getting something where they just decide, you know what, like let's just exit this era. I just don't think that's gonna be out there unless he's really like can go like a year plus staying on the court, playing consistently without any issues, which ultimately makes me feel like, yeah, he's probably gonna stick around, and especially because he's got those non-guaranteed years. It's just, that would require them cutting him to save money. So, I don't anticipate that. But if it ever came to something, drastic, okay, they have that option. Yeah. But no, it'll be interesting. Just let's see how the lottery goes, because I'm sure that's going to be, that will play a big part. Even if they like get the second or third pick, I'm sure those, the speculation will definitely start.
It's going to be fascinating, them going into the lottery, because, like we've already talked about how interesting the Cooper Flag part of this would be. But if they were to land the number 2 pick, you talk so much about they need a new point guard with DeJounte Murray gone. You could just plug Dylan Harper right in, right? Dylan Harper, I think, for me, Dylan Harper would be the best case scenario for this team, obviously outside of Cooper Flag. But if you're just talking about purely fit, Dylan Harper would be an incredible fit for what this team needs, at that point guard position with DeJounte out. And then if you go one pick down, Ace Bailey feels like the exact guy that they just got rid of, right? Brandon Ingram, right? The tall, tough shot maker who doesn't make a whole lot of plays on the ball. Well, I think Bi is much better on the ball than Ace Bailey is right now. But ultimately, Ace Bailey extremely talented. But is he a guy the Pelicans really need right now when you already have Trey Murphy, when you already have Herb Jones? I'm not really sure. So I think this lottery with all of this talent, I think it's extremely interesting from a Pelicans perspective because all of these guys, they kind of put the Pelicans in a different position based on where you land. Where I think if you're Utah, I think it really doesn't matter where you land. You take the best guy available and you figure it out from there, right? I think the same thing's true for Washington, or you can go down the line. But I think it's a much different thing for this New Orleans team because they have some talented young pieces already in place. So now it's not just about just getting a young talent, but it's about finding someone who can fit with what you already have.
That's interesting. You bring up if they get a guard like Harper, could be a bridge from DeJounte Murray eventually to Harper, just in case, Murray's injury makes them decline a little faster than they hoped. So, no, they'll have a lot of good options there. Yeah, just take the best player available, figure out the fit from there. Just these are good problems to have. So that's just like the underlying, I guess like good part about the season. It's unfortunate this injuries happen, but out of they probably would have been selecting like middle of the first round. They're fortunate now they're going to get one of the top picks in one of the best drafts in years. So we'll see how I'm sure though. And they've drafted so well over the past few years, identifying Trey Murphy, Herb Jones, wherever they did. I don't think the front office gets enough credit for just how well they've done in the draft, supplementing Zion and Ingram over the years with these players.
I agree.
Yeah. And I'm sure whatever they end up doing with the draft will probably play out well. A couple more things. CJ McCollum, probably didn't expect to go there, but he's a guy who I expected. They're definitely probably been trying to move him over the past year. Because if you told me that, paying attention to the salary cap, I know that with if they were going to keep Ingram and they were going to keep Zion and then extend Murphy and Herb Jones, that it's going to be hard to. I think they ideally would want to move off CJ McCollum first before moving off Ingram if possible. Didn't work out that way. Didn't seem like there was a ton of interest for McCollum with his contract. He's got another 30-year left on his deal. I would guess probably would have caught an asset to get off him, a draft pick or something, which probably didn't make sense. But now I think it might be a little different because now that they took care of the Ingram situation, they've rebalanced their salary for next year. They're going to have some tax flexibility. So unlike the past 2 years where they go into the season over the tax and then try to figure it out from there, now I'm starting to wonder if McCollum might actually have a future in New Orleans, if that may have flipped. Now that all their other guys are taken care of for the most part, he'll be extension eligible. And he's been a player who's been very proactive getting his extensions done. It's very rare for a player to get an extension when there's 2 years left on his contract. He's done it twice. He did it with the Blazers, and then he did it a couple of years ago with the Pelicans. So I'm keeping an eye on that. I feel like at this point, that might be something that they might look at. Do you think there might be now a future with CJ, especially now with Murray's injury?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I definitely think that CJ is a guy that they love within the organization. They love, just the professionalism, his approach. Trey Murphy has talked a lot, throughout this season about how much he's learned from CJ McCollum and just the way he puts in his work on a daily basis and the things he does to take care of his body, how much he monitors his sleeping habits, how much he invests in, his trainers and the stuff he does away from the team, the workouts late at night with some of his own guys that he pays. I think they love that presence in the locker room to kind of show all of these young guys what it's supposed to look like. And I think the way CJ has performed this year has only, confirmed a lot of the stuff that they already knew about him, about how seriously he takes the job and how much he doesn't allow, outside stuff to dictate his effort, his focus, his approach, on a day-to-day basis. And they want that to bleed into everybody else. And I think Yeah, you're 100% right that I think that it's much more likely that he's going to be around long term with this team rather than him being like a guy that they trade away as an expiring contract. I can tell you that he's kind of, he's spoken about this a little bit publicly, but I think behind the scenes he's been much more vocal about wanting to be in New Orleans. His family's very comfortable in New Orleans. He's a guy. Obviously, we know he spent a large chunk of his career in Portland before coming to New Orleans. I don't think he's a guy who wants to move around a lot during the latter part of his career. I don't think he wants to go into a situation where, let's say, he gets traded to a playoff contender, he plays a year there, it doesn't work out, then he gets traded somewhere else. I don't think CJ wants that towards the end of his career. I think he would prefer to sign long term with a team, be able to put his roots down, allow his family to settle. I think that would be the preferred route for him, and I think he would like that as if it's in New Orleans. And I think, considering everything we've already said about DeJounte Murray, they need some help at guard. C.J. McCollum is a guy who you can plug in at the one, at the two, can be productive, can be a guy who shows up night to night, can accept different roles on ball, off ball. So I think that there's an obvious fit with him in New Orleans, and I think there's a desire on his part to be somewhere where he could just feel stability long term. So I think you're exactly right that it's much more likely that he'll be around in New Orleans for the next few years rather than him getting traded in the offseason.
Yeah, it seems like it completely, his whole outlook with the team flipped. Just throughout the year, I was just kind of like breaking my head trying to find CJ McCollum trades. I was thinking maybe Detroit would be interested, having inherited a lot of the Pelicans front office, and that would have helped the Pelicans with all those salary issues I mentioned. But just doesn't, also not quite on Ingram's level, but also somewhat of a difficult guy to plug in on a lot of teams, mainly because how much he makes, but also kind of a combo guard. A lot of, I'm not sure how much he helps like some of the best contenders out there. So I could see like the Pelicans clearly value him, and he's been there for 3 years now. His role seems to be changing quite a bit now. Like if the projected lineup that included Ingram actually all got to play together this year, I was thinking McCollum would probably be coming off the bench. And I do feel like that's probably coming soon when this team is fully healthy. But it just seems like a great role for him going forward. It's because the Pelicans could really use that element coming off their bench, that scoring punch. And he should, as he gets a little older, they don't have to have him play quite as much, and he could really thrive in that role going forward. So yeah, it's wild for me. Like in my brain, it completely flipped. Like, oh, they got to get him out of here. To what? No, they should probably keep him now. Two more things. Exactly right. Yeah, two more things. So if they do something next offseason, I feel like maybe it is pursue a big man, and Yves Missy's played pretty well considering he's a rookie. I don't know how much I expected from him. They have the flexibility to get another big man if they want it. That's something I kind of curious about. If they would want to get a better veteran big man, like a player who's already ready to start, and then that can let Yves Missy come develop a little more slowly going forward, or if they're all set and they want to just continue starting Yves Missy and just give him the keys.
No, I think we talked to David Griffin the other day, right after the trade deadline, and he kind of revealed a little bit of his cards here because he said one of the things that he didn't like about this team is that I think the wording he used is it was one of the worst rebounding teams of the last 15 years, and I think a big part of why they've fallen off so much defensively is that they're just an awful defensive rebounding team. Just night to night, especially in the past few weeks, they've just been really, really bad, defensive rebounding. They've had some games where they're starting Carlo Makovich and Yves Missy in the front court with Zion Williamson because they just are so desperate to get anybody out there who can grab a defensive rebound. And I think, Yves Missy has been one of the huge bright spots for this team, a 19-year-old, stepped in as a starting center, played most of this season, a guy who didn't start playing basketball until he was a teenager, and has been a consistent guy for them night to night at the center position. But like you said, he's still a very young guy, still learning the position, learning how to, a very difficult position to defend night to night. When you look at some of the great centers around the league, and being able to rebound and, staying out of foul trouble and contributing offensively. It's a lot to put on a young guy. And I think just having another guy in who can come in and just soak up some minutes, get you some boards, be reliable in that role, I think is going to be really important for them. But again, I sound like a broken record here, but I wonder how much you prioritize that versus finding a point guard, who can fill in those minutes while DeJounte Murray is out, because they just don't have. I don't think you can do both, right? I think it's going to be difficult to find a real starting point guard while DeJounte Murray is out, and a real center who can play 20 to 25 minutes every night, and you feel really good about that while Yves Missi is on the bench, because those guys are hard to come by. I think the center position has become a much more valued spot around the league, as you've seen some of these centers really become, some of the best players in the league. With, obviously Jokic at the top and Embiid, but even like the Sabonis's of the world, Şengün's. There's a lot of these guys who have become very valuable, and you need a guy who can at least contend with those guys night to night to make it difficult for them. And I think it's very difficult to find those players. That's why it was such a huge win to hit on the Yves Missi pick. But I think finding another guy who can be as good or better than Missi, I think it's going to be pretty difficult for the Pels, just because I don't think a lot of those guys are available on the open market. And then how much do you have a desire to give up future picks to get that guy is going to be a real question as well.
Yes, and you bring up a really good point I hadn't even considered. They'll probably need to address point guard, get another guard while Murray's out. I would say that's probably a bigger priority than getting, trying to prioritize a bunch of assets or tax flexibility to get another big man, when you could probably, they found Daniel Tice for the minimum. Didn't quite work out, but maybe there's someone not quite making that little, but maybe someone that you can just bring in to help with the rebounding issues you mentioned and just go from there. All right, last thing I wanted to ask you, and this is just kind of like, I guess, an overall like general outlook type of thing, but if they go, let's say the Pelicans go into next season, they're mostly healthy. Murray maybe comes back a little earlier than expected. But for the most part, they're healthy and everyone's playing like as well as you can possibly ask. But for whatever reason, maybe they're like below the play-in range. Maybe they're just kind of like not too much better record-wise than this season. Like I'm talking kind of a worst-case scenario type of thing. At what point then could there be some uncomfortable conversations about the general core and maybe certain pieces? Could then like actual like quote unquote rebuilding or retooling conversations begin if it gets to that point?
No question. I think next year is going to be the year, especially if they bring Willie Green back. I think there's going to be a lot of questions about what's this current core, what's this current front office. As much as we both agree that they've done a really good job, I think there are going to be some questions about this front office and what they've done to kind of get to this point, and maybe some of their shortcomings. And then my other question would be, who's the draft pick? What does that draft pick look like at this point next year? Right. I think that's going to be a big part of the how good you feel about the core. Right, if you draft Dylan Harper, they get off to a slow start. He looks a little better during the second half of the season. You can start feeling okay, like they've got something, right? I think at the core of your question is, what if you get to the All-Star break next year and it feels like there's really nothing here, right? What do you kind of do at that point? I think that's when you start having serious conversations about Zion Williamson. You start having serious conversations about the front office, the future of the franchise. But I think, what we kind of pointed to previously is that you still feel really good about Trey Murphy and Herb Jones, right? Those two as the foundation of whatever this team is going to be moving forward. You feel really good about those guys. I would throw Yves Missi in that mix as well. You feel really good about those three. And then you kind of go from there. I think they kind of have the flexibility to continue to pour into this current group, or you can kind of think about life without Zion Williamson, life without C.J. McCollum, and go from there. I think they have the ability to go both directions. But, as been the theme throughout our talk here, a lot of it just falls on what is Zion Williamson doing, how much is he on the court, and how much is he lifting everybody up. I think that's going to be the story for this franchise for the next 12 months. who is Zion Williamson post Brandon Ingram, and how much can he make this team a contender, or how much can he, lead to them having to blow this thing up?
Yeah, next year will be year 7 of the new era, which coincided with selecting Zion, and it just feels like this might be it, because now they finally made those moves, bringing in DeJounte Murray to round out that core, and now they'll have a top pick. We'll see what they do with that, but it just seems like, I don't know. It seems like at this point it's starting to get a little too long with this, without any real meaningful playoff results. So I'm keeping an eye on next year. I think this will be a massive year for the Pelicans. I'm not sure it's really being discussed enough, but
it's funny because I feel like we've been saying this for 5 years straight about the Pelicans. It's gonna be a huge year for the. we do this so often with the Pels, man. It's just life in New Orleans because it's the constant, the uncertainty. I think that's the real frustrating point for a lot of New Orleans fans. It's just you look at the roster and you feel good, and then you go into the season and you never really see what you hope to see. And I think that's been the most frustrating part about this entire Zion era, is that they never really got to see what it was supposed to look like.
Yeah. It's more, every year has been more like, okay, is this the year we're finally going to have them all together and look really good? Now it's more like, is this the year where it's even is it practical to even continue with this group? I think it's gotten to that type of turning point for next year. So no, that'll be a major thing. Just keep an eye on what they do. Will, thanks for being on. I'm always used to saying thanks for having me on. You're my first guest. Thanks for being on. Thanks for doing this. So Will, you guys can follow him at his name, at Will Guillory, on Twitter. You can find all his work at The Athletic. Will, do you have anything coming up we should be keeping an eye on?
Just a lot of looking forward to the draft. I'm planning on doing a Zion Williamson piece in the next few days. So yeah, keep an eye on that, and just pray for me that I don't join the long list of Pelicans people who are injured here. I'm trying not to step on any cracks or walk under any ladders or anything like that. There's enough bad luck going around in New Orleans right now. I'm trying not to add my name to the list.
All right, we'll pray for that. All right, Will, thanks for being on. Stay in touch, and and just some quick plugs from me. You guys can all follow me if you're watching this on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter, Blue Sky, my name. Follow me, subscribe on YouTube, and subscribe to Third Apron. Got a lot of good stuff coming up as we get closer to the off season. All right, that's all. Thanks, everyone.